Hi, my name's Rolly. I'm a microbiologist at the University of British Columbia. I'll be answering your question about what creates such vast differences in sizes between the genome of humans and plants. It's a really interesting question, and it relates to some fascinating fundamentals about evolution. I chuckled when you described the human genome as tiny, because the simpler, more ancient forms of life that I study, like bacteria, have way smaller genomes. The genomes of humans and other plants and animals are at the very least 10 times larger, but more like 1,000 to 10,000 times larger than bacterial genomes. So we need to include bacteria in our explanation of what forces shape the growth or shrinking of genome size on our way to explain why human genomes are smaller than typical plant genomes and crop species like wheat. One of the major forces shaping genome size is simply that making DNA takes energy. Every time a cell divides, it has to duplicate its DNA. The larger the genome, the more the cost. So consider this. Some bacteria reproduce every 23 minutes, while humans can only reproduce roughly every 14 years. So for every single human reproductive cycle, there are equivalent 320,000 reproductive cycles for a single bacterium. You can imagine that replicating a large genome is super expensive the more often you have to do it. So there would be a greater pressure for these organisms to abandon whatever genes they really don't need to survive. Think of moving all of your belongings from one house to the next, then over and over and over again, 100,000 times. After a while, you'll get tired of bringing everything with you, and so you'll start leaving things behind, like your basketball net, your toaster, your pajamas, your extra forks and knives, and focus only on what's most important, say warm clothes, food storage, your shoes, and maybe your socks. But really, that's only half the story. Our survival would depend on what we have to do after we move to each new place, or for that matter, what the next generation of organisms also has to deal with. So, for example, if we don't have a job, all we need is a couch and some books. If we have a job, then we'll probably need a bicycle, a backpack, a computer, a coffee machine, many more things. So how small a genome is able to shrink depends on how complex the environmental demands are on that organism. This is classic evolution acting on the size of the genome. Even though it sucks to have to replicate a larger genome, you can't abandon genes you'll need to survive, no matter what the cost. So, for example, take a very stable environment like the ocean at the equator, where the water temperature is warm year-round, has a consistent salinity, and a regular cycle of 12 hours of sun and 12 hours of darkness. Conditions don't fluctuate much, so organisms adapted to this environment tend to have smaller genomes than ones which grow in fluctuating, more complex environments like northern rivers and lakes. Now we have an explanation for what shrinks a genome, but what causes one to grow? For starters, large genomes are a feature of larger, more highly evolved forms of life that have evolved over a greater period of time. So they've had time to pick up genes by a number of processes I don't really have time to describe in this video. But it's not just having the time to evolve, it's also managing the cost of replication. As I previously mentioned, these organisms tend to reproduce less often, so costs are reduced. But perhaps, more importantly, they've figured out ways of storing energy and passing it down from generation to generation so that the cost of replicating DNA is no longer a real concern. Larger organisms can afford to be more wasteful and are able to carry around more DNA. Having extra DNA means more genes, more tools and capabilities, but surprisingly, the greatest difference in genome size, what makes a genome hundreds or thousands of times larger, is excess DNA termed junk DNA, because we don't actually know what it does. There are many hypotheses for what junk DNA may be good for. One generally accepted explanation is that having junk around allows for experimentation and for new traits to evolve. So picture a garage or a drawer full of knickknacks where you store random bits of whatever. Wood, different materials, plastic bags, electronics, elastics, stuff that has no immediate purpose, but it's also no real cost for you to keep it around. Yet, when something comes up that the junk might be useful for, say a replacement part, or to hold something together, or to add a small new function to something, then that junk becomes useful again. And the theory goes that if it's no big cost for us to keep this junk DNA around, we'll bring it along and we may find use for it, well, millions of years later. Now, to answer your original question, you're correct that plants tend to have larger genomes than animals, and that major crops from the grass family like wheat and barley also have larger genomes. But in truth, genome size differs dramatically across all eukaryotes, and many major crops like corn, rice, soy, and root vegetables actually have smaller genomes than humans. Still, why is there a general difference between plants and animals? Well, frankly, it's still a bit of a mystery. There's a hypothesis that the larger your genome has become, the more quickly it will accumulate junk DNA. So one guess is that, early on, plants were better at supporting larger genomes, which has snowballed over time. We know that plants are far better at accommodating extra copies of their genome. We humans have 2 genomes per cell, one from our mother and one from our father, but plants commonly have 3 or 4 and upwards of 10 or more copies of their genome. Wheat actually has 3 genomes per cell, while a group of ferns set the record for having over 1,000 copies of a genome in its cell. So, this permissiveness may be related to why plant genomes have increased over time at a more accelerated rate than humans and animals. I hope that's a good start for you to explore a more detailed answer to your question. I also hope I gave you a good overview of what shapes genome size in general. Thanks for listening, and I love talking science. Have yourselves a wonderful day.